I'd like to welcome you this evening to our program. And I'm going to ask my friend, Joe Golson, who's the director of the French Institute, which is a collaborator with the Scowcroft Institute. Actually, we've been collaborators since I came here 13 years ago, long time, to introduce our guest, who's a Hagler Fellow, which is a great honor at the university. But Joe, could you do the introductions?
Good evening. As Andrew said, my name is Joe Golson. I'm the director of the French Institute and a senior Scowcroft Fellow at the Bush School. It's a real honor and a special privilege for me to introduce Henry Rousso. Henry Rousso, although he's way too modest to say this, is one of the most prominent historians alive today. He is certainly one of the most prominent historians of World War II and its memory in Europe, and has been for many, many years. In 1987, Henry wrote a book called The Vichy Syndrome that literally changed the field of study of the memory of World War II, not only in France, but elsewhere throughout the world. Henry was, as a young historian, was also the director for the Center of Contemporary History and has been a visiting professor not only as a Hagler Fellow at Texas A&M University, but at Harvard University, Yale University, and Columbia University. He has also recently, in 2019, been asked to shift his field somewhat, and that is that President Macron of France invited Henry Rousso to chair a presidential commission to create a national museum memorial on terrorism in France, which will open its doors in 2019. So tonight we've asked Ollie to speak about one of the subjects that he's been a past master and an expert at for many years, and that is the extreme right and fascism. One of Henry's books, in fact, is called Stalinism and Nazism. So please join me in welcoming our Hagler Fellow, Henry Rousso.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First, before my talk, I would like to thank all those who contribute to my invitation at Texas A&M University, the Hagler Institute for Advanced Studies, and especially John Jenkins, Clifford Fry, and Amanda Scott, the Bush School of Government and Public Services, and especially the Dean John Sherman, Professor Andrew Natios, from the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs, Monica Heller and Cassandra Meduzia for their invaluable help, and finally, my old friend, distinguished Professor Joe Golden. I must admit that in the current international and national context, this conference was quite uneasy to prepare. For a historian who has been working for almost half a century on unparalleled catastrophes of the era of fascism and the Second World War, its premises and its consequences, there's something vertiginous about the feeling that writing history has probably done nothing or too few, at least not enough, to ward off the return of the past. My lecture will focus on 3 points. The lecture, The Legacy of Historical Fascism, is a tremendous topic. You can imagine. I mean, I have 30, 45 minutes. I will try to focus on some points, and I will be pleased to answer to some questions. The 3 points are a small analysis of the current change in global politics. My second point was the question of memory and the legacy of historical fascism in collective memory, especially in Europe. And the third one will be fascism and post-fascism, plural, what possible comparison and what for. First point, and this is not a surprise, we are probably at the eve of a major change. Over the past 40 years, I've given many lectures, including here on the legacy and memory of fascism in Europe, mainly in France, which is my field, my first field actually. The aim of these lectures was essentially scientific, to understand how collective memory of traumatic catastrophes influenced in the short or the long term the societies which went through these events. Time to time, there has been a vague concern that fascism or something resembling it could once again become a danger to our civilization. I'm thinking, for example, of the 2022 French presidential race, when Jean-Marie Le Pen, at that time the head of the National Front, then a tiny far-right group, appeared to be present at the second round of the election against Jacques Chirac. The last won finally with 82% of the voters, including a vast majority of the left. No one could imagine at that time that Le Pen, the father, carrying a far-right ideology rooted partly in collaboration or the defense of French colonialism, could become a serious competitor in such an election. We were in 2002. Today the situation is completely different. In 2017 and 2022 in France, Marine Le Pen, the daughter, was twice present at the second round of the presidential election with a high number of votes, 34% in 2017, 41% in 2022, the highest score of the French far-right in a national election. In the same way, 2 weeks ago, the AfD, Alternative for Germany, the far-right party, achieved a high electoral score with 21% at a national level. These two major cases in Europe don't mean that fascist parties are about to come at power in France or in Germany. Neither the French National Rally nor the German AfD are claiming to be in the path of historical fascism. But both, at least it's a question to raise, have links with its past. Both are challenging the traditional democratic values, and both are seen by the majority of, on the one hand, the French opinion, on the other hand, the German public opinion, as a symptom that a red line designed in the post-war period has been crossed. There are, of course, many other situations in the world where traditional democracy is challenged, even threatened by political movements that can be described as post-fascist, populist, national populist, or illiberal. It's interesting to see that all these terms are not exactly defining the same kind of regime or political movements. And the fact that it seems, in a certain way, difficult to define them and to establish precisely common points in different national contexts is an issue as such. And I have to recall, as a historian, that was already the case with fascism in the 20s and in the 30s, and afterwards, of course. Mussolini's regime, Hitler's regime, or Pétain's regime may have had similarities, in particular the hate of democracy and the total rejection of the Enlightenment ideals. They had also many differences. For example, to just one example from my own field, I never considered the Vichy regime to be fascist in a strict sense, a question that has given rise to many historiographical quarrels. The Vichy government and the Vichy regime had neither a single party nor any desire to wage an imperialistic war, since, on the contrary, it was born on the desire of a large part of the 1940 French political elites to stop a war they didn't approve, while Stalin was considered as a higher danger than Hitler. On the other hand, thanks to Pétain regime and the strategy of collaboration, France became, during the war, one of the main resources for the Third Reich at war. Consequently, whether a particular contemporary political system is fascist or not is less important to my own view than understanding what it does, what it thinks, and who supports it. A political regime can be dangerous for our freedoms without being called fascist or even post-fascist. My second point is about the memory of traumatic past, which was a field I worked on for a long time. I've been studying for decades the collective memory of traumatic events, that is, events that have left deep and lasting traces over several generations. This has been a growing field of research in the humanities and social science since the end of the 20th century. However, and it's probably easier to see today, this was not just a scientific trend, what has been called by many social scientists the memory boom. A lot of historians, for example, decided to work not just on the history of a period like myself, on the history of the Vichy regime, but also on the memory and the representation afterwards of this Vichy regime. As a historian, I began working on World War II and the German occupation in France in the mid-70s. This was a sensitive period of French history, but nevertheless, I consider it, as a young historian, as a rather remote past. I thought then that I could do my job as a historian without too many obstacles. Less than a decade later, in the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, I realized this wasn't the case. France, as many other European countries, were more and more obsessed by vivid memory of the 30s and of the 40s. These years were not only history, but were growing as a permanent public debate about the hidden aspect of previous official narrative, or to what extent some countries, Vichy France, Germany, and many others, were accountable for a complicity with the Nazis. This is one of the reasons why many historians and social scientists began to invest this field of collective memory. That is how this event had been represented, commemorated, and why it was still an issue several decades afterwards. When I explained to the students why I changed a little bit my field, beginning to the history of the year 1940, 1944, and then shifting to understand the representation of these dark years, as we say in France, from 1944 to the present day, which is a different topic. I will always explain that getting out from the archives, from the National Archives, where I was trying to work at the time, it was rather difficult because the archives were closed. I opened the newspaper, and the question of Vichy was on the headlines all the time. There was a scandal, there was a controversy, somebody was accused to be a collaborator, a new fact was revealed in the press or whatever. So suddenly, at that time, I realized that this period was not over. This wasn't history, this wasn't even memory, this was part of the present. And of course, it's important to understand that, to understand the question of the legacy of historical fascism. And this problem was throughout Western Europe. A generation of German, Belgian, Italian, or Dutch historians, joined after 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, by Polish, Czech, or Hungarian historians, were asking themselves the same question. How had this history, been told since the end of World War II? Why so many elements have been played down or undercovered? This is particularly true of the Holocaust and many other Nazi crimes committed with the full collaboration of other nations. It took decades all over Europe to document these questions and to insert this dark side of the story into national narrative that the wartime generation preferred to forget, to move on. And this insertion, can say that the national narrative was done with a lot of controversies. There was not a majority to accept the idea to transform completely the national narrative of many European countries about their role in World War II. In this respect, West Germany, and then the west part of Germany, and France have been at the forefront of these initiatives. Remember, for example, the German Chancellor Willy Brandt kneeling at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Monument in 1970, or later French President Jacques Chirac declaring in 1995 that France was accountable to have helped the Nazis in the killing of 75,000 Jews. This belated awareness of the magnitude of the Nazi and fascist crimes can probably explain the contemporary idea of the duty to remember, le devoir de mémoire, as we say in French, the need to remember the victims of genocide, mass crime, colonization, slavery, everywhere in the world. Whatever is the relevance of some claims on the question of memory, it is a fact that this way of dealing with the past became an essential element of democratic society in the early 21st century. Policies of remembrance or policies of the past are today a fundamental indicator of the democratic character of European societies, again challenged by many sectors of the public or the political spectrum. And there is no coincidence that they are these policies of the past, one of the first targets of illiberal European governments, like, for example, in Poland a few years ago, or like in Hungary today. History, the writing of history, and the sources to write history, like the National Archive or the National Library or the universities, are often one of the first targets of fascist or post-fascist movements. Until today, most fanatic far-right movements still pretend, for example, in France, that the Vichy regime was never anti-Semite, not to say that the Holocaust never happened. This is a key point for me. It's a generality, of course. I gave you some ideas. I won't focus on each national situation. It's impossible. But this is a key point. To my point of view, you can identify a post-fascist ideology, at least one of the main elements, when it needs to rewrite history, when it needs to deny the crimes committed in the past. Like, for example, Éric Zemmour in France, a small fanatic far-right leader who explained book after book that Pétain saved the French Jews, a good example of fake history. The question for me, because this is my field, how let's say, a leader of the extreme right today in France, he's rather young, he's 60, he's rather young, let's say, needs to rehabilitate the Vichy regime of Pétain in order to promote a new kind of far-right ideology. This is a key point. Why they need history, why they need to whitewash the history of World War II. And it's a common point of many, not to say all, the far-right European movements. Until today, this is one of the answers, and it's quite a very obvious answer. It is very difficult and very risky for an extreme or far-right movement to just claim that what the fascists did in the 30s or in the 40s was fine, and that they wish to continue the job. After 1945, of course, Nazism and fascism became absolute evils. References to Hitler became the absolute insult to discredit an opponent, what Leo Strauss called already in 1953 the reductio ad Hitlerum, or contemporary social networks calling the Godwin point. That's why, to my point of view, this is an interpretation I'm doing about what's going on today. Explicit references to this past, like a Nazi salute, or just today in France, there was a problem with a Nazi salute by students. I think it was in Sciences Po, one of the major high education institution in France. So it became common. Or the use of Nazi mottos like the AfD talking about Alles für Deutschland, and many other. You have a lot of examples of like that. So what does it mean, to my opinion, today? I don't speak about tomorrow, but today it means that these references to the Nazis are, of course, firstly, provocative attempts to push back as far as possible the tolerance threshold established after World War II. This is a clear will to distort history because it's still impossible, at least in European societies, to praise the behavior of the Nazis who, after all, destroyed the continent, beginning with their own country. This said, you know that, I mean, I didn't teach you anything new now. This said, does this tremendous investment in keeping traces of or repairing the sequels of the fascist periods prevent any return of the ghost? After all, it was one of the objectives. The first aim of this global trend was to redress, ignore, or forgotten injustice. The main explanation for all so-called policies of memory are the idea and the will for the state with a kind of oppression of the civil society to repair historical injustice. Whatever you agree or not, I mean, it's a kind of a definition of what is a policy of memory today in Europe. And the movement I was describing at the memory boom in the 80s or in the 90s in France and Germany and many other places, this was a kind of moral and progressive ideal supported by a younger generation judging the older ones, judging, for example, the generation of the war, who they said didn't do enough to analyze, to take to explain the whole responsibility of what happened during the war. But it's not the only reason. To my opinion, this investment in memory expresses, and it's still the case today, also a credo deeply rooted in contemporary culture. Knowing the past, keeping alive the memory of the victims, stigmatizing the perpetrators of state crimes, even putting them in belated trials like in France, could and should prevent us from coping to comparable situations. How many times do we hear the never again expression, which is coming from World War I veterans, and we know what followed. They knew another war. Who seriously believe that commemorating the Holocaust has prevented other genocide since 1945? So we can question the effectiveness of those policies of remembrance, policies of memory, and their capacity to awaken consciences sufficiently to ensure that such crime cannot be repeated. Never again seems to be a wishful concept with no real impact. I wrote that for the first time probably 30 years ago. I had the feeling that this investment in memory was on the one hand necessary to have a new account, a new narrative of what happened during the war, but at the same time, on the other hand, that the idea it could prevent any other kind of a comparable mass crime was a complete illusion. But after decades of thinking about these issues, I will add with a glimmer of optimism that without this investment in education, in the transmission of memory, and in the collection of victim testimonies, mainly for the Holocaust or other mass crime, the situation would have been worse. So, my third point would be fascism and post-fascism. What possible comparisons and what for? Today, the comparison with current national situation and Nazism, it's every day. You open the French media, you have 2, 3, 4 articles, radio, podcasts, whatever, all the time comparing contemporary situation to the question of the fascism or Nazism. So, I'll try to do it myself. I'm not completely convinced that the exercise is easy or even fruitful, but I try to do it. Because you ask me in a certain sense, and because we have to. We have to, because as a historian, being aware of what's going on in my own times, I have to take into account that this comparison is becoming a public problem. It's not just, the question is not just, is it true or not? Can we define Marine Le Pen as Nazi or not? No, this is a part of the public debate today. So as a historian, I think I have to bring my own my own stone, ma propre pierre. Voilà. So, the question is, because I'm a history of memory, despite all the efforts to remember and prevent the human disasters of fascism, are we facing comparable situations today? Then I will begin, as usually, for historians to be very careful. Come on. History doesn't repeat itself, blah, 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 blah. I heard that since 40 years. It's risky to compare different historical situations without oversimplifying the past and the present. This is precisely what I'm doing tonight. I mean, it's impossible to raise this discussion of a comparison without simplifying the case. And this is a problem for historians. To my point of view, I mean, it's a traditional debate in history. Can we compare or not? Which is not exactly the same in social sciences or political science, which compare all the time. In history, it's a big deal. Can we compare? Of course. History is based on comparison. You can write history, for example, if I'm writing a book on Vichy today, if I do that, I can't just forget that there is an extreme right which is much more powerful today in France than it was 30 years before. So comparison is part of the job. That's why I try to do it. So we cannot just compare historical fascism and post-fascism. This is not just a comparison between two vague concepts. We need to distinguish, which I won't do tonight because I haven't time, but we need, it's a kind of a cautious before entering in the core of the topic. We need to distinguish, if we compare the causes, the ideology, the seizure of power, the government, or the social support again. So, and there's another difficulty when you go into this comparison. There's a strong difference between countries which had a concrete experience of fascism, whether they were under the rule of fascist regimes or under the rule of German or the Nazi occupier during World War II, or both, and countries which never had this experience before. If I take the French case again, which is easier for me, sorry, the question isn't whether Marine Le Pen looks like Marshal Pétain, obviously not, but to what extent her contemporary national rally plunged its roots in former French fascist movements, and to what extent this ideology is still alive in France. After all, I said it already, his father's National Front was founded in the early 70s partly by former collaborators. What remained today of this genealogy, even if the National Rally made extensive efforts to cut with its past? That is the question. And here I introduce, in a certain sense, a kind of a theoretical question. If I want to compare the situation of, let's say, French post-fascism today with the French fascism in the past, it's not just a comparison. I'm not just comparing two different things. I'm trying to establish if there is a link or not. I'm trying to do something which more close to a genealogy than to a comparison, which is a different concept to my opinion. So despite its difficulties and despite my obvious reluctance to consider comparison as useful, I'm going to try the exercise. And I will only consider 3 points. So don't worry. I mean, I won't look at, I don't know how many elements you have to compare with the articulated point of view, these two things like historical fascism on the one hand and contemporary possible avatars. These 3 points are the general context, the question of the legitimacy of power, and possible ideological continuities. So, differences in general context. There are, of course, tremendous differences between the context of the interwar period with today's context. There is nothing comparable with the consequences of World War I and the humiliating Treaty of Versailles for Germany, the earthquake of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, and the hope versus fear it created over Europe. All the consequences of the Great Depression and its tens of millions of unemployed all over the world. I mention here very briefly some of the traditional causes of the rise of fascism in the 20s. However, contemporary societies, and especially Western societies, had to cope in last decades with a series of shocks that have considerably weakened belief in their ability to bring progress and improve living conditions. The impact of terrorism on a global scale, economic shocks, the great pandemic, and the weakening of traditional representative democracy. All of this probably open the door, as we know, to all forms of populism and create a global instability. Here, if I take a minute more, I'm talking about terrorism. I have him, as Joe Golson was mentioning it, I'm in charge of creating a museum on terrorism. And terrorism is not a historical thing. I mean, we are at the global situation in facing the threat of terrorism. One of the discussions we have in my mission between all the people who are working with me, historians, lawyers, whatever, is a very simple question. Does terrorism win? I mean, this is a simple question. Terrorism is a kind of a war. In a war, you have winners and you have losers. Does terrorism winning? And the answer is very difficult. On the short-term perception of terrorism, well, you can say terrorists lost all the time, practically all the time. But they lost on one specific point, to destabilize the society. Like, for example, what happened in France after November 13, 2015, or, of course, here after 9/11. But what about the situation of the same society on the long term? And this is a completely open question. And there are disagreements, including with people who are working on the same topic, who are very close to. And for me, for example, terrorism has a tremendous impact on the political culture, on the disaggregation of traditional parties, because it plunged the society into a kind of a fear. It called for the public actions with more repressive actions, and also all the debate about what about new laws which risk to jeopardize the rule of the state, for example. This has many debates about terrorism, not only in France, but this is, for me, one of the reasons why a country like France has been destabilized in the last decade. So, the second point, the issue of legitimacy and seizure of power. Là, j'ai fait une demi-heure. Je peux continuer? Bon, I'm checking the time. So, one of the main differences between fascism and other forms of authoritarian regimes, such as military dictatorships, is that they rely, at least in part and at least initially, on an enthusiastic support of the masses. Certainly, these masses were or are manipulated by a large-scale dissemination of propaganda and fanatical speeches denouncing mainly internal enemies, Jews, socialists, communists, foreigners, immigrants, and so on and so forth. Certainly, neither Hitler, nor Mussolini, nor Pétain came to power through a fair election. The seizure of power was partly the result of a climate of fear and political violence, willingly provoked by the Italian fascists in 1921-1922, or by the Nazi paramilitary troops like the Sturmabteilung before 1933. In the case of France, it's different. Pétain, in a certain sense, came at power. It was a result of the terrible military defeat of June 1940 and the collapse of the Third Republic. But in each case, I just took here 3 cases, you have a climate of violence, which is the context of the arrival at power of these people on these movements. And for the 3 of them, they were not the majority in their respective countries. They were not the majority in their respective countries. However, this climate of violence, however, they were called upon to lead their respective countries by legitimate chief of state, King Victor Emmanuel III in Italy, Hindenburg, President Hindenburg in Germany, and President Albert Lebrun in France, because they enjoyed widespread popular support due to their ability to propose tremendous changes in their respective societies and because of their charismatic dimension. Here again, this is one of the key traditional key points you must focus on when you talk about fascism. But by charismatic, I refer, of course, to the Max Weber definition, not the result of a real charisma from the leader, but merely an irrational belief in alleged capacity of this leader to present him as an extraordinary one, which usually he wasn't. Pétain has no charisma at all. He was a very old man, but we were speaking like that. He became a prominent figure at the beginning of the occupation. The charisma was not his own charisma. The charisma was the idea that the French people thought he was, or what he would do. That was the main explanation of the success of Pétain. Hitler, it's different. Hitler had, of course, or Mussolini, they had a certain amount of charisma. So, to sum up, and I'm sorry to sum up so briefly, the beginning of historical fascism has been, all the time, a mixture of violence, mass support, and deals between the old and the new right. This is one of the major explanations for the arrival at power of Hitler. Today, the situation seems different. Contemporary illiberal or populist governments don't come to power by force or even by violence so far. They win regular elections in regular races. Some of them even lose an election after the first experience of power, as it was the case in Poland with the populist Law and Justice Party, which quit the power in 2023 after putting an end to a nature authoritarian power. But on the contrary, both fascist and post-fascist regime depend on propaganda, and both, this is to me one of the similarity, use new technology to influence the masses, the radio in the 30s, or the cinema, social networks, and AI today. Moreover, at the global scale, deliberate political lies and organized disinformation from inside as well as from outside has reached today a level probably unknown in the past and affecting a much larger number of people than in the past. This could be a much more worrying situation than in the 30s. In the same way, the legitimacy of illiberal regimes could be wider and stronger than the one of their predecessors. I took again the example of France. It's an image, of course. If Marine Le Pen wins the next presidential race in 2027, she will have a stronger legitimacy than Pétain, who got full powers in July 1940 by just the 2/3 of representatives of the two chambers who were absolutely scared by the military defeat and the chaos that followed in the country. So one of the problems today is, if we want to compare these two situations, that the legitimacy of the new kind of post-fascist regime or ideology would be, could be, or is much more important than it was in the 30s. Even if it's in the framework, usually in Europe it's still the case, in the framework of democracy. That's why the concept of illiberal movements, it's interesting because it's not liberal, but still existing in the framework of traditional democracy. How long? Quotation mark. This is, to my opinion, what is really at stake today. As my colleague, the historian Timothy Snyder, wrote in a recent book, much of the power of authoritarianism is really given. Then it's less important to compare a historical situation of creating a kind of fear by repeating that we are facing a return of the ghost than to understand the very nature of contemporary regimes as such. We need to understand their own ability to destroy some basic principle of democracy, the rule of law, the respect due to political opponents, freedom of speech and academic freedom, helping the weakest and protecting political, ethnic, or gender minorities. All these principles were swept away by historical fascism when they came at power. My third and last point of comparison is the question of ideology, of course. other ideological continuities. Historical fascism was a form of exclusive nationalism, which is still, to my point of view, the hallmark of all far-right movements. Nationalism in the 30s was completely different from the one that fostered the 19th century nation-building process in Europe. This kind of nationalism of the 30s was an organicist conception of society, based not on a community of free citizens possessing rights, but on an ethnic community of individuals with more duties than rights. In this conception, the nation was considered as a body, and the citizen as part of this body. Nation was and is the supreme value above freedom, above equality, above everything. When the Vichy regime replaced the famous French Republic motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, which is still the motto of the French Republic, liberty, equality, fraternity, or brotherhood, whatever you translate it, by a new one, travail, famille, patrie, work, family, fatherland. It didn't mean that the so-called national revolution was just praising these honorable values, what anyone could accept. I'm for je suis pour le travail, je suis pour la famille, je suis pour la patrie. No, what it meant that in the new France, in 1940, supposed to be close to fascism, even if I have some criticism about this notion, each citizen would be part of a specific body. The profession, like in all corporatist movements in the fascist regimes, the family and the nation, under the rule of a leader in each case, the boss, the householders, the pater familias, and the father of the nation, Pétain. The organicist conception of a society is also based on the rejection of entire categories of population. Foreigners, whether they were immigrants or refugees, Jews, at that time, whether they were nationals or foreigners, and other ethnic categories. This nationalism aimed to create a nation rid of its so-called impure element by using social engineering processes. This is the social engineering process, and the fascist movement were not alone in this perspective, of course. This is one of the characteristics of totalitarian regime, which means they wanted to change the whole structure of a society by force. In Nazi Germany, this led to the Holocaust. Contemporary nationalism, of course, is different, but with rather similar concept to my point of view. There is this idea shared by our populism that the people, quotation, is or should be a single entity, hence its rejection of plural democracy and diversity. It defends the need to protect the national identity by rejecting, again, minorities, instill an exclusive conception of the nation. That's why far-right anti-Semitism is still alive, for example, in France today, even if it's not the only source of contemporary anti-Semitism. That's why Islam as a whole is seen as a danger. That's why immigration, quotation, or some kind of immigrants are considered as a major threat everywhere in the far-right movement in Europe. In this perspective, one of the key concepts has been forged by a French intellectual. Hey, thank you. Renaud Camus, who pretended that Western societies are facing a great replacement, a pure conspiracy theory that should be challenged by remigration. I don't know if you can say it in English. Remigration, not immigration, remigration. Concept rooted, to my point of view, in the organicist theory of the 19th and the 20th century. If we want a remigration, if we want to change this so-called a great replacement, you need to change the society by force. That's exactly the consequence. This is exactly what the fascists did in the 30s. Linked to this exclusive and aggressive nationalism, almost all historical fascism, except in France, also exalted strength, brutality, and warlike virility. The glorification of war has been a central element to define fascism, not only because Hitler or Mussolini aspired to conquer new territories, but because the preparation for a war allowed for a form of permanent mobilization of the country, This mobilization was supervised by a whole series of organizations of the Nazi Party or the Italian Fascist Party, which led to a militarization of this respective society. While the glorification of brute force, both in domestic affairs or in international relations, brings fascists and their contemporary avatars together, I think they differ on the issue of war, which is not an aim of most contemporary illiberal regime. Was probably, but it's a tricky question with a remarkable exception, probably Putin's Russia. To end this topic, I will finish by a quotation. Nationalism can be seductive because it seems to exalt love of one's country, which I think we can all share. I love my country, you love your country. But nationalism is nothing of the sort. Patriotism is love of one's own. Nationalism is hatred of other, wrote not de Gaulle, but the French writer Romain Gary in 1945. As a former member of the resistance, he knew what he was talking about, because the most striking illustration of the difference between patriotism and nationalism is the fact that in most of the countries occupied by the Nazis, most pre-war nationalists choose without hesitation to collaborate with the enemy. Today, most of Europe's far right seems, maybe I'm wrong, they seem fascinated by Putin, who can be considered more or less as an outspoken opponent of Western civilization. So, what conclusion about this brief remarks? I'm sorry, j'ai tenu le temps là. Okay. I'm anxious about time, all the time. So, comparison between past and present could be certainly fruitful. After all, we should learn from experience. But as I said, just denouncing a possible return of the ghost doesn't have the same impact than before among new generation. This is exactly the same argument to defend the European Union. If we don't have a European Union, we will have war again. My goodness, yes, we have a European Union, and maybe we'll have war again. Okay, so as a boomer, born 10 years after the end of World War II, I can deplore it that this argument isn't enough to awake consciousness, but it's a fact. And I can deplore it, but the biggest mistake an older generation like mine can make in politics is to imagine that it will fight the old same adversary as if the world didn't change in the meantime. I gave you just an example, a famous example in French history. In 1945, Charles Maurras, who was a leading intellectual in France, a theoretician of French nationalism, who became a fervent supporter of the Vichy regime, was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role during the occupation. On hearing the verdict, he explained, "C'est la revanche de Dreyfus." This is Dreyfus' revenge, meaning the revenge of the French captain falsely accused of treason because he was Jewish, one of the greatest scandals of the late 19th century France. By uttering these words, by designing the same old enemy, the Jew, Charles Maurras, despite being a sharp intellectual, showed how unable he was at that time to understand the changing world he was living in. We were on the end of World War II, Europe was collapsed, and he was still thinking in the framework, le logiciel, the name in English, the app of the beginning of the 20th century. This is a huge political mistake to my point of view. Then, if referring to fascism as the absolute evil no longer works, should we invent another one? I don't think so. And I'll finish, and I'm sorry for that, with a somewhat naive conclusion, more as a, let's say, a citizen than a historian. If there is still such a thing as democracy, it means then I still believe in the superiority of law over force. I still think that the raison d'être of politics is respect for the other, whatever their color, their status, or their origin. I strongly believe that this principle should be defended, whatever we name those who want to destroy them. Thank you.
Joining us on the stage is Professor Fritz Bartel from the Bush School to ask questions of Dr. Rousso. Fritz, I'll start off with a question that I was thinking about while we were listening to this. The British novelist Martin Amis was once asked what was the appeal of Nazism, and he said, "Never underestimate the degree to which Nazism appeals to the cruelty or the sadism of individuals." And I've been thinking about this a lot. Is cruelty an element of fascism, whether today, or do you see that as an element, or is that just, that was just the opinion of Martin Amis?
No, I think he's right. Of course, I think he's right. I mean, you hear me? Right. There have been a lot of work in the 2 last decades about the consequences of World War I. And the usual traditional explanation is about let's say, at the international level, the Treaty of Versailles and the humiliation of Germany. But there are many other kind of explanation. And I'm referring to a famous book written by an American historian, I forgot the name, sorry. Fallen Soldiers, that was the title. One of the ideas was the tremendous amount of violence shared by all the belligerents in World War I, and that all the societies which were involved in World War I knew threshold of violence completely unknown before. And this habitude, this used to violence, this used to live into a world where there was no more law, no more possibility to protect the other, whatever, continue after the war. And it continued especially in Germany, not exactly in France for other reasons, but it continued in Germany. It continued in Italy. Italy was not a loser, it was part of the winner. But in Italy, there was as you know, a kind of a resent about the result of World War I. They didn't get what they wanted to have. But the main thing for me that the violence was not just imposed by the Nazis. The Nazis used the violence of the society of many groups, les corps francs, the Freikorps, for example, that was all around Germany after World War I. So the question of violence is not one way. The Nazis, of course, used violence, let's say, I can say today, in a terrorist perspective. Terrorists mean they're using fear. Violence is the best way to scare a whole population. That's exactly what they did with with SA before these were exterminated by the SS. So violence, for me, is the key word for the context of the arrival at power at fascism. And then it became a method of governance. Well, at that point, you must distinguish between different regimes, what are trying to do, because you can't just talk about fascism without making differences between the society. I didn't mention Spain, for example. We can put Spain in the fascist era. Was Franco regime a fascist regime? Not sure. I mean, when you have a Catholic regime, like Pétain was a Catholic regime, it's difficult to say he was a fascist. Well, fascism was, in a certain point, the rejection of religion. So you have many, many difficulties. But the key point in Nazi Germany and Italy and maybe other countries was, yes, brutality. And what happened during the war with the Germans, what the Nazis did, not only the Nazis, but the whole institution of the Nazi Third Reich, including the Wehrmacht, did it in the battlefield, was linked to this violence, which came from, partly came from World War I, before becoming a key ideological element of the ideology.
Thank you very much for your talk. There was so much there to think about, and as a historian, I agreed with you, the struggles that you talked about in terms of both the inadequacy of history to prevent a recurrence of past issues, but also some of the hopes that you had for, or others have had in the past, for trying to remember and then not repeat. So I was wondering how you, when you were thinking about and speaking about, at the end you seem to be suggesting that continuing to think in terms of fascism or perhaps post-fascism might prevent us from accurately understanding what's happening in the present day. Is that a fair characterization of what you said, first of all? And if so, does it suggest that we should be learning something from these movements and trying, not to say that we would agree with them, but how should we respond to them? Because are they suggesting something about, let's say, the liberal order as it was pre-2016, or whenever you would want to start this, that says we should be learning something about what their rise suggests, and therefore change our ways, whether it's responding on questions of immigration or culture, identity, or something like that, or is that doing precisely what Tim Snyder says of power is being freely given, right? You're accommodating its rise by trying to adapt to it. How do you navigate that type of question?
Well, you ask the question and you give the answer. So.
Oh, did I?
No. I mean,
I don't feel like I've answered that.
Yes, I think you give the answer. I completely agree with you. Well, you're right. I mean, for decades, I mean, again, I'm talking about the French case. When Le Pen became let's say, a visible party, before 1972, the extreme right was completely expelled from the political spectrum in France. For many reasons, the memory of collaboration and the outcome of the Algerian War. Most of these fascists, there was many fascist movements in the 60s, they were referring to for example, one organization which was called the OAS, which was an extreme right terrorist organization who killed about 2,000 people, which was an unbelievable number. So they were not accepted as part of the political spectrum. Le Pen began to be famous because he was not alone, a small party, which at that time didn't want to be part of the traditional political debate or whatever. It was mainly provocative, whatever. His daughter, of course, if you know a little bit the French situation, is doing exactly the contrary. She tries to normalize the party. She tried, and she was rather successful, if I see what is the situation in France. They had now a third of the French parliament. So, and I remember when I was younger, and thinking and discussing with colleagues and people, for example, from the Socialist Party, and we were some intellectuals who were still saying, stop saying this is the return of fascism. Maybe it's true, but what is the effectiveness of the argument? Think about it. You say, oh my God, fascism is returning, meaning you're talking to people for which fascism is a real threat. Oh my God, it's coming back. We have to do something. But when 10, 20, 30 years after you say the same thing and you talk to people for which fascism is no more a threat, they don't even know what fascism was, it's completely inefficient. Mm-hmm. This is the first step. So also, when you see most of these parties, I mean, take I took the example of le Rassemblement National, the National Rally in France, or the AFD in Germany. There are a lot of discussion to say to what extent they're affiliated, there's a genealogy with the past. If I took the question of Marine Le Pen, I was rather embarrassed when Marine Le Pen, talking about the Vichy regime, it was a few years ago, adopted exactly the Gaullist position of the interpretation of the Vichy regime. So I couldn't say Marine Le Pen is she is following the legacy of Pétain. She was saying exactly the contrary. Was it sincere or not? Well, we are in politics. It's not important. I'm sorry. But, well, first, I think she was sincere for one political reason. And she said it many times. We have to get rid of the experience, the memory, the remembrance, the reference to World War II. And in doing that, it's not just she wanted to normalize her party to get what she finally got today, but also it was the main claim for all the far-right parties since 1945. We have to forget this period. And this is a key element for me, because it means including today, including probably the most radical far-right extremists, they cannot just claim, I want to finish the job of the Nazis. They can do it. En français, je dirais que le vice rend hommage à la vertu. Je suis incapable de le traduire en anglais. Ça veut dire, in a certain sense, even these people, they know that Nazis was a kind of absolute evil. So they have to go around. They have to create, and if they want to create a new ideology, which is in the basis are more or less the same, their opponents have to understand that and to challenge not the past, but the present. Mm-hmm. And as a result, the motto, fascism is going back, is returning, doesn't work in Italy. She's prime minister. Doesn't work in France. She could be president. So this argument is dead. I mean, I'm sorry. I think that's what I try to say in a certain way. In my this argument doesn't work. It doesn't mean that this is not fascism. En mon fort intérieur, deeply, I think it is, in a certain sense, fascism. But it's not the problem.
So I have to conclude with are you on the side of the famous statement, those who do not remember the past are doomed to repeat it? Or are you on the side of the argument that those who only remember the past will never amount to anything? Which side of the debate are you on?
Oh my God, don't ask this question to a historian. Well, I have to confess that I'm at the end of my career, so I've been a historian for now 50 years. So I think sometimes the past is a burden. Not sometimes. Today, the past could be a burden. We have done what had to be done for the victims of the Holocaust, for their memory, for the victims of the other genocide, for other victims of mass crime. I'm building a memorial for the victims of terrorism. The idea of pay a tribute to the victims, not to forget them, has been accepted. It's today, to my opinion, at least in Europe, in the European Union, something deeply rooted in the culture. This is one thing, but thinking that reference to the past will help us today, every time, to cope with the future, I think it could be a mistake. We are alone facing our future.
That's a great note to end on. So would you join me in thanking Dr. Henry Rousso?